Great. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on the budget this week. We've got me speaking along with Stuart Hogan and Dan Bates. So there's three of us to have a go at it today. And there was actually a lot more in the budget, as we've just been discussing, than we were expecting. So it's a pretty full agenda of things to get through today. I'll kick off with a review of the budget and then looking at the impact on local government funding. Then Stuart will come in with his view of how the budget might play out in the 25-26 settlement and beyond that. And finally, Dan will pick up with his analysis of the budget and his assessment of the impact of the budget on local authority finances. Just to let you know, we are recording the webinar. The recording will be available hopefully later today on the website, possibly Monday morning if it takes me a while to edit it and get it loaded up. Slides will be on the website straight away after the session. So normal format for the day, we've got presentations from the three of us from 10 till 11 and then 11 till 11:30, chance for discussion and questions. So to start off with the autumn budget, in my session, we'll start off looking at the overall economic forecast and the fiscal position, the background, the context to what's going on, the decisions that the Chancellor's made on tax and spend. Then we'll look at more specifically the additional funding that was in the budget for local government, more than we were expecting, that's for sure. Look at core spending power, what the assumptions are behind that, and the £1.3 billion of additional grants that were announced in the budget. We'll look at council tax assumptions as well. I'll look a little bit at that, but Dan will look at that in a bit more detail. There's possibly more to find out there than we know, and that could have an implication for the overall amount of funding that we've got. Then we'll look and speculate a little bit about the potential distribution of that 1.3 million, how much would go through the social care grant, how much would go through some kind of targeted deprivation type funding stream. Then look at employers' national insurance contributions. And this is, I think, the question that I probably had most of in the last few days. Will we get funding for those additional, the cost of those additional contributions, and when will that come through? Then there's a whole range of other smaller grants to look at, then the business rates, and then looking a bit further ahead at the spending review phase 2 and the process over the rest of this year and into next year as well. So starting off, the context to this budget and to the budgets in many of the recent years is that growth is low. It's forecast to stay low and from 26 onwards to stay below 2%. And there are risks that this could be lower still. The Bank of England's forecasts are well below 2%, I think even below 1%. So if the growth is lower than forecast, that might result in the Chancellor having to come back either with further spending restraint, further borrowing, or further tax increases. So the numbers that we'll look at later in terms of future spending projections, there's quite a significant risk to those if growth doesn't match up to expectations. One of the big announcements that the Chancellor made on Wednesday was these new fiscal rules. I think most commentators have said that they are they're more sensible, they're more flexible. So the first one is the stability rule, that day-to-day spending broadly would match by revenues. The Chancellor herself admitted before the budget that this would bite the hardest. So debt interest payments, along with other day-to-day spending, would be included within that rule. The second fiscal rule will be the way that the government's going to measure debt and investment, this so-called investment rule, and looking at this new measure of debt, public sector net financial liabilities. It's a broader measure of debt, and it includes some of the revenue generating elements of assets as well, things like the student loan book, for instance. Additionally, I thought that was thought to have generated additional capacity of about 50 billion of additional borrowing, but the Treasury on the OBR reflected on that and restated the figures, and that's quite a bit less. But it still allowed the Chancellor to continue with the same levels of capital investment rather than making those cuts in capital investment, which would have been the case had she continued with the old fiscal rules. Also, the targets for balancing the current budget will change from a 5-year rolling forecast to a 3-year rolling forecast, which will more broadly coincide with the timescales that will be used for the spending reviews. And in theory, that will make it harder for future chancellors to game what's going on against those fiscal rules. So it's a good outcome in terms of sort of good prudent management of the public finances. But alongside lower growth, we've got permanently higher public spending. This is partly after the pandemic itself, and we can see on that left-hand chart just how much public spending, looking at total managed expenditure, has jumped compared to what was going on before the pandemic, and even compared to recent budgets and recent forecasts for public expenditure. It gets high in 25-26 quite quickly, and continues to grow after that as well. It's quite striking, really. Public expenditure is looking like it will be it will reach about 44 to 45% of GDP. So it's almost 6 percentage points higher than it was before the pandemic compared to GDP. So it's partly about higher debt and interest payments, but also about all these pressures coming through from the NHS, social care, defence, schools, benefits, justice, you name it. Everything seems to be putting pressure on the public finances. And the flip side to that is that the Chancellor has announced some really significant increases in tax revenues, £40 billion of additional tax revenue by 29-30. This is comparable to Norman Lamont's 1993 budget and much bigger than Brown and Osborne's first budget. So some really significant increases in taxation, equivalent to 1.2% of GDP by 28-29. That compares with 1.4% in Lamont's 1993 budget. So historically big increases in taxation to pay for those increases in spending, and also the low growth as well. The main increase in taxation is from the employers' national insurance contributions, estimated to generate roughly £25 billion in gross terms, with a cost to the public sector of about £5 billion, which will be funded by the Treasury, of which more later. There's some comments that there were some interactions between those national insurance contributions and profits that might reduce the increase in revenues, but I think that's one of those risks that we always see in budgets. But no change to the main rates of taxation, employees, national insurance, income tax, and VAT to match up with the election commitments. And all that leads to, despite the big increases in taxation, that debt will be persistently higher. It's higher than it was forecast to be in the spring budget. It's steady, but at a much higher level than planned previously, and at a much higher level than we were used to only recently. The only good news is that it's forecast to stay below 100%, but only marginally so. And it's vulnerable to many of those risks on tax growth and spending as well. So the background to what's going on in the budget and what will happen to us in terms of funding for local government is that it's very tight. They've increased spending significantly, but that's put a lot of pressure on increased taxation and a lot of pressure on debt as well. And there are lots of risks around that. I guess the other part of good news from the budget was that it's resulted in some quite significant additional resources in the budget. Local government is growing a lot more quickly than any other part of the public sector. Now, if you said that in 2015, you'd laugh. It was the opposite way around. In that period from 2010 to 2015, local government did worse than almost any other part of the public sector. So this is kind of, it's compensating for that, but it's only partially compensating for what happened to the sector during austerity. There's another question as well about whether it's enough. We know that it's not going to be enough. We know that the increases in funding are not going to be as much in future as they have been recently. And I think most of the representative bodies have responded with some thanks and some welcome to the increased funding for the sector, but acknowledging that it isn't sufficient. The numbers here borrowed from a good chart from the IFS. I'm not sure whether that includes all the additional revenues, things like the EPR revenues or the business rates on private schools, but nevertheless, the big increases, the big announcements will result in some big increases anyway. And that will just continue the above average increases in funding that we've had in local government since about 2019. As I said, that only partly reverses the huge cuts in funding that we had during austerity. Interesting that health and social care is close to the average, although that got in cash terms a large increase. It's only just marginally above the average increase in funding for the public sector as a whole. And that might partly explain why the social care increase is relatively small, and also why we think there could be some pressure on to reduce the amount of funding that goes to the public health grant. So NHS increases, also Department of Health increases, not particularly large. Most of that's gone to the NHS, not leaving much for social care or possibly as well for public health either. But also you can see there lots of competing priorities: defence, energy, justice, benefits, all manner of other things getting big increases as well, just not quite as big as local governments. So core spending power, headline announced in the budget that core spending power will increase by 3.2% in real terms in 25-26, and that will include an increase in grant funding of 1.3 billion. In the budget itself, we were told that there would be £600 million of additional social care funding, so that was confirmed in the budget. In briefings alongside the budget, we were told that there would be £700 million of targeted funding within that 1.3 billion. The comment I picked up there was that this will start with a deprivation-based approach in 25-26, with additional funding targeted to the places that need it most. So my assumption from that is that there's more funding available within that 1.3. It could be something around 700 million, and that will be targeted towards authorities with the most deprived populations. That kind of suggests that existing funding streams won't be touched that much, but that's not a guarantee. So I'm assuming there's some kind of new targeted funding stream that will be within core spending power. We're also assuming as well that funding for employers' national insurance contributions and the other grants that were announced within the budget will be outside that 1.3 billion, in other words, in additional to that 1.3 billion. Funding for NICs, for instance, though, I'm sure it will come through the settlement, but the 3.2% real terms increase will be adjusted for that additional funding. In other words, you've effectively got a new burden that will need to be adjusted for. So it won't change the real terms change, but it will put more money through the settlement. So that estimated increase, based on the numbers that are in the settlement, 3.4 billion or 5.25% in cash terms. So that's 1.3 billion for the grant increase, and then we've assumed 2.1 billion for council tax. But there's more to think about there, as we'll discuss later. To convert that into real terms, we've just applied the inflation target for CPI, which is 2%. But sort of a note of caution there that other measures of adjusting to get to real terms are lower. So the September CPI is 1.7%, and the forecast for CPI and the GDP deflator are both much lower, around 1%. And if you use those lower inflation assumptions, that would mean that you'd have to have a lower cash increase to get down to that 3.2% real terms change. So what is that about? Is it a different inflation adjustment? Are the lower grant increases than we know about? Some other parts of the settlement that are being adjusted, for instance, or are the lower council tax increases than we're assuming? We don't know yet, but it's just a warning flag there, really, that there's, as ever, there's more to find out about this settlement. Just quickly looking at council tax, and Dan will look at this in more detail later on. We're still assuming that those council tax referendum principles are unchanged from 24-25. So 2.99% core increase, 2% precept, and then £5 threshold for district councils. We know that fire authorities are pressing for a return of their £5 threshold. The history of it there in that bullet point. We don't know whether that will come through, and we haven't assumed that as a default setting in our budget, in our model either. But as I said, some of the numbers in the budget do suggest that they might be based on lower increases in Band D. Nothing was mentioned explicitly in the budget, but it's just a red flag, as I mentioned. And there's no indication as well that the additional revenues from the second home premium will be equalised. So that power is available to authorities or to billing authorities from April 25. And I'm assuming most of you will take that up, and that could be quite a chunky amount of money for some authorities with lots of second homes. So the main thing here, the main question I've been asked over the last few days is about whether there will be specific additional funding for those national insurance contribution increases. I'm pretty sure that the funding is additional to the 1.3 billion. The evidence for that is, first of all, historical precedents when the health and social care levy came in, which increased employers' national insurance contributions. That was funded through the budget and was funded through the settlement as well. It was ultimately reversed because the increase was reversed, but that's the historical precedents. There's been guidance from officials, both in Teams call immediately following the budget announcement itself. I wasn't on that call, but I heard secondhand that the funding would be additional. And also in an email from Nico Hislop yesterday to authorities, he said, we will set out more detail on our plans to compensate local authorities for the increase in contributions. So I think that's pretty clear that they're intending to do so. And finally, there's funding available within the budget itself. So there's £4.7 billion set aside in 25-26, rising to 5.1 billion by 29-30 to fund the public sector effect of the increase in NICs. So, and we understand that's a pretty reasonable assessment of the total public sector costs. So we're expecting that's what will be distributed out to authorities and to other parts of the public sector, and we'll find out about that in due course. The one concern is just custom and practice, and just that, you know, these things have a habit of changing over a period of time in the run up to a settlement, and I'm just worried about that, and just want to flag that again as a possible concern. How much will the funding be? I don't know. I mentioned £200 million in an email earlier this week. That was just based on the amount of funding that was available for the health and social care levy, which is a 1.5% uplift in NICs. Although the rate announced in the budget is slightly smaller, the rate increase is slightly smaller, the threshold change will mean that the cost to authorities will be higher, and quite a few authorities have contacted me to say, you know, that their cost will be quite substantially higher than it was under the health and social care levy. So we wait to see exactly how much we get, but we are still expecting on balance that will be additional funding over and above the 1.3 billion. So how might that 1.3 billion pounds be distributed? To start off with, we don't know. We're guessing on some of this stuff. We can be fairly sure that 160 million pounds, so fairly sure that 600 million pounds additional will go into the social care grant. But as you'll be aware, within that there are two elements about how that's distributed. One is to use the adult relative needs formula. The other is to equalise some or all of the precept. To date, only about 160 million pounds of the 500 million pound precept's been equalised. So that's tended to push more money towards higher tax base, lower need authorities. But I think it would be a fairly easy change for the whole 500, if there's a 2% precept again, to equalise the whole of that 500 million pound additional revenue from precept. And that makes quite a big difference, particularly to authorities that have got very high tax bases, places like Surrey County Council, for instance. That's a fairly easy, I think, a fairly easy one to put in place for ministers. The next possible way of putting the money through the settlement is simply to index settlement funding assessment. That's what the LGA and what the IFS have been assuming as well in the run up to the budget. We'd assumed a cash flat settlement SFA increase, but I think it would make sense to index that normally in the way that's been indexed since about 2020. So we put that through as an assumption within our model now. And then that would leave about 420 million pounds to put through what might be some kind of new deprivation focused funding stream. The SFA is already fairly progressive. It is weighted very much towards authorities with higher levels of deprivation and lower tax base, but ministers might argue that it's out of date. And actually it gives funding to every authority, regardless of whether they're low or high deprivation. So they may want something that's more focused and uses something like, I've suggested the overall IMD score. The final option is to put some of that money through the other grants within core spending power, services grant, RSDG, New Homes Bonus. I think it's probably really unlikely. The last government, that would have been a prime target to put money through, as we'd seen, but I don't think so this time round. I am still assuming that NHB will remain in 2025-26, but even that, you know, there was no mention of it in the budget, so we don't know. But that's still my assumption within our modelling. For those of you who had a chance to look at the latest version of the model that I put on the website last night, I did put through one option that might indicate how that targeted funding might be distributed. So it's just, and I've used the overall IMD, and the reason I've used that is simply because it's really the only kind of off-the-shelf index I could really get my hands on. We could look at some of the old RNFs that are within the SFA, but I think overall IMD is probably as good an indicator as any. So I've used that. If you have an alternative suggestion, or you'd like me to look at something else, I'll happily do that to see what the impact would be. Because at this point, all we're doing is just modelling potential scenarios. We don't know what ministers will do. And as you see there, if we did use overall IMD, I mean, a good sort of benchmark is to look at what happens to metropolitan districts compared to what happens to counties. So Met's share of SFA is about 26%, but its share of this kind of weighted overall IMD that I've used is about 32%, so quite a bit higher. Then in contrast, for shire counties, their share of SFA is about 16%, and that would fall to only 8% in the measure that I've selected. So it would move money quite significantly differently from the SFA if that sort of measure was used. So if as I'm suggesting that the additional 1.3 billion is distributed through a combination of uplifting indexing the SFA, putting £600 million into social care, and then having a targeted fund of about 420 million using the overall IMD, that would give about 30% of that additional funding to Mets compared to only 26% in the SFA. And in contrast, that would give counties about 18%, so slightly more than their SFA share, but that's just because they tend to get a very large share of the adult social care funding. That's just because of their population demographic base. Other questions there about how much will go to district councils, how much will go to fire authorities. I've tended to really reduce that in the modelling. Very low share to districts and nothing to fire. I don't know how that will play out. I don't know whether ministers will want to direct money towards upper tier functions or whether they'll want to spread it out more evenly across different tiers. That's just things you can change in the modelling, but we just don't know yet. So very briefly looking at some of these other grants, social care grants, 600 million we've talked about. Then the Market Sustainability and Improvement Fund, unchanged from our assumptions, but just to note that I had assumed that the workforce grant had rolled into MSIF in 24-25, but that the underlying workforce grant is being cut or was being cut after 24-25. It's due to be zero in 25-26. I've got that cut coming through the MSIF grant, just to let you know about that. I've not changed that following the budget. And I've made no change either to services grant, RSDG, minimum funding guarantee, or New Homes bonus following the budget. We've still got, for instance, minimum funding guarantee cut from 4% to 1%. If SFA is going up slightly more than zero, say it does get indexed by 1.7%, there's possibly a case for MFG going up by more than zero, but so more than 0%. So just to correct that, MFG in my model is going down from 4% to 0%. Public health grant, I've downgraded our forecast for that from in line with inflation, 2% down to 0. And that's simply because that non-NHS expenditure within the Department of Health looks to be under significant pressure. In fact, it's being cut in cash terms. So just assuming that if there's less funding in that budget, that might flow through into public health funding as well. Extended producer responsibility was I guess a welcome windfall. We'd had some indications that there would be a windfall from this, but this is starting to put it more in black and white. The budget estimates that there'll be new revenues from EPR of about 1.1 billion starting in January 25. And from in 2025-26 itself, those revenues are guaranteed by the Treasury based on the central estimate that we'll get from DEFRA about what those revenues ought to be. We're expecting DEFRA to advise us about what the revenues will be and how they'll be split between different authorities. So how will they split between waste collection and waste disposal? How will they be split geographically, etc.? So we need to know more about who's going to get what before we know exactly what the benefits will look like. We've been told that the details will emerge in the local finance settlement process. I don't know what that means, the settlement itself or the process leading up to it, possibly in the policy statement later this month. Although, to be honest with you, I would expect us to be receiving something directly from DEFRA rather than waiting for the settlement. But we'll see. DEFRA tends to be a bit slow on some of this stuff and have kept us in the dark, to be honest, through much of the development of this policy. It appears from what authorities are telling me that the additional costs related to this part of EPR could be relatively small, but I've had no confirmation of that. It's just what authorities are saying to me. Is it a windfall? It does appear to be, and we assume as well that it's outside core spending power. And as far as we can see, the proposals to adjust the settlement have been dropped as well. That was the indication of what they wanted to do when this was being proposed a year or two ago, but that seems to have been dropped. So it looks genuinely like a windfall, and we will update the model and include it in the model when we know more about the scheme and what the numbers look like. Very quickly on the business rate retention scheme, the standard multiple will be indexed and the small multiplier frozen. So the same as in the current financial year, and that's already how we had the MTFP model set up, so no change there. The standard multiplier will be indexed by roughly 1.67%, so that's the change in the index on the September CPI. That will take the standard multiplier up to 55.5 pence. We put the cap compensation fractions in the model now as well. So our calculation is that it'll be 133 over 499 for the small multiplier, 93 over 555 for the standard. But we note that CIPFA's calculation for the cap comp on the small multiplier was 134 over 499 due to differences in rounding. Reliefs for retail, hospitality and leisure properties will continue, albeit at a lower rate. So we've not changed the amounts that we forecast in 25-26 in the BRS tab. We've just assumed that you'll put in lower amounts of relief, and that will result in lower amounts of Section 31 grants. Confirmation that business rate pilots outside the Trailblazer deals will continue in 25-26, but to be honest, we had that in already, and in fact, we've assumed that those pilots continue right the way out to 2029-30. Very briefly on charitable relief for private schools, that comes in April. The legislation will be introduced and subject to parliamentary approval will be in place for April. Some exceptions to private schools where they're mostly doing business to provide support to pupils with healthcare plans. They will continue to be eligible for relief. Estimated increase in net rates payable is about 70 million, rising to 85 million once it's fully underway. HMT don't take account of any behavioural changes. Those additional revenues are shared broadly 50-50 with authorities. But we don't know what the distribution of those additional revenues will be. Some parts of the country will get quite large increases, others next to nothing or nothing at all. But that's just the way that the BRS scheme works. So finally, looking at spending review phase 2, this will be announced in the spring. What we do know is, if you see that chart on the right-hand side, that the spending increases, the public spending increases have been very much front-loaded. In the autumn budget, plus 4.3% in 24-25, plus 2.6% in 25-26, and then dropping to 1.3% increase from 26-27 onwards. So that will be the numbers that will flow into the spending review in the spring. And then if you look on the left-hand side, for unprotected services, that translates into a real terms cut of 1.1%. From 25-26 onwards, but that's much better than it was in the spring budget when that cut was expected to be about 2.3% real terms. And as we know, local government has done much better than the average in 24-25 and 24-25 and 25-26, and I think might expect to do so over the remainder of the spending review. Most commentators think that the government will have to come back and revisit these increases. They're too low. They can't be. They're probably not going to be stuck to. But I think for now, we've kept our assumptions for SFA still at zero, cash flat, with social care funding increasing at £600 million a year. So not much better than we had before the budget. Maybe you should argue we should be a little bit more optimistic, but for now, we're just going to stick with that. And then finally, process and timescales. We've been told to be what's now become a feature of the timetable. A policy statement on the settlement in November, which will be good, which will give us some more advanced notice of what we can expect in the settlement, both for 25-26 and over the medium term as well. Provisional settlement mid-December, and I'm expecting to see some kind of consultation paper on the principles for funding reform at that time. Then we're waiting for the spending review phase 2 in spring 25, and possibly what I expect as well, some kind of full consultation paper on funding reform in the spring, but certainly before the summer recess, and then a full implementation of the multi-year settlements and funding reforms in December 2025. So we're going to have a lot going on over the next year to 18 months. And more about that from Stuart.
Hello, everyone. Just got the Okada deliveries successfully, so a little bit
well
out
done,
of breath, but very pleased with that. Okay, so what I thought we might do this morning is just look at selected areas in the budget, some of the key policy things that came out. So first of all, the kind of prelude to the budget. The budget was the 118th day of the Labour government, and the period up to that was rather curious, wasn't it? It was full of acclamation for doing fairly ordinary things like having a meeting with mayors or visiting Dublin. But yet, ministers showed themselves curiously cautious and inhibited in that period, unwilling to open up about what it was they had in mind. And some of that was no doubt the iron grip of the Treasury, otherwise known as the dead hand of the Treasury. So don't say anything that implies any expenditure till we've had the budget. And that was compounded by an unusually long gap between the election and the budget. But equally, lots of people have said that there was surprisingly little evidence of fully formed ideas, policy proposals, things that they came into government wanting to do. And all of that contributed to a bit of a loss of momentum in that period. Wednesday's budget, I think, represented the firing of the starting gun on so many different processes, and they really needed that to respond to the pressure that they're under. I would characterise the overall approach that they're taking, particularly in the area of local government, is to do as much as possible, as soon as possible, but within very real constraints of time, money, and legal security. And they'll have very much had at the front of their mind the upcoming ordeals of the provisional settlement and the vote on the final settlement, which are not very far away at all. So let's turn then to the financial allocations. And as Adrian said, there's a reference in there to reforming the approach to funding allocations within the local government finance settlement by redistributing funding to ensure that it reflects an up-to-date assessment of need and local revenues. This short reference sounds an awful lot like the former Fair Funding Review, doesn't it? It implies a needs assessment, almost certainly a reset of accumulated business rates growth, taking into account the costs of service delivery in different areas, including rural areas, also taking into account the resources available locally to fund services. There'll need to be some kind of transition over time as part of a multi-year settlement. So these are all things that we've talked about before and were worked up in some detail up to the consultation papers in 2018. And the timetable links this to what is potentially a 3-year spending review from 26, 27 in the spring. It may just be 2 years, but 3 years is an option, with some consolidation of pots of funding that's been promised. The timetable to pull all of that off for 26-17 is very, very tight, and will need at least one likely consultation in the spring. There's also a reference in there to starting this whole approach with a targeted approach to allocating additional funding in 25-26. Additional is my emphasis. The reason for that is that it's legally more secure to play with the additional money arising from the budget than it is to touch pre-existing allocations, and this is especially the case when you've got one short consultation to pull this off after a provisional settlement, likely in December. I think their priority for that will be to correct what they see as a deprivation bias in settlements over the past 14 years or so. In other words, figures that Dan and Adrian have showed many times before, that the more deprived authorities have tended to do less well in the overall outcome over that period. So they'll want to do something to correct that. But there's another thinking behind that as well, which is to try in the settlement to move towards the likely outcome of reform in the longer term. recent settlements have tended to move away from the likely outcome. If you think of the piles of accumulated business rates in areas that don't represent relative needs, and also the way the tax base changes over time, again, not well matched to needs. So recent settlements have moved away from where you want to get. You want to try and not do that if you have in mind doing reform, just not to make your job more difficult when you come to do that, not to make the transition more challenging. So the easiest way to do that for me is to put money through the main settlement. It'd be possible to have a new formula based on the deprivation, and we might see that. But the problem is there isn't an awful lot of time to consult on that. It's well precedented to use the main settlement, the kind of SFA resources, but we'll see. Overall, then, as we've heard, it's a reasonably good settlement in the circumstances, although less good than very recent years, with a 3.2% real terms increase in core spending power in 1 year. I think we'll see the usual balanced package. So we'll see some boost to mainstream settlement resources, the SFA. We'll see an increase in targeted social care allocations. Limited consolidation of pots, moving away from competition. There'll be a view on reasonable council tax increases, policed by referendum limits once again. I think it's too late to do anything about new homes bonus, so we'll see that continue for 1 more year. We'll continue to see embedded payments for negative RSG, and I think we'll see extensive use of safety nets as well. So all of this will be in an upcoming policy statement. My guess is it will be at or in the days leading up to the provisional settlement in December. As far as the medium term is concerned, I think we'll see something on the approach and timetable for the review, including how the department proposes to work with the sector. And if I were doing it, I would include what we call guiding principles. The last time we went around this course, which are set out in the 2017 consultation paper. And we set down things like simplicity, transparency, making it contemporary, sustainability, robustness, and stability. And the idea was, if you can pin your colours to that particular mast, it reduces the scope for argument as you move towards a final decision. You focus in on the areas in which ministers have real discretion, but as far as possible, you're using up-to-date data and the best possible statistical techniques to allocate the resources. Okay, enough on financial allocations. Let's move to structural reorganisation. So the upcoming English devolution white paper will include working with councils to move to simpler structures that make sense for the local areas, with efficiency savings from council reorganisation helping to meet the needs of local people. I think it's seldom a sentence has carried so much weight or asked so many questions as that one. For most people, this was both surprising and, dare I say, unclear. It was well trailed in the technical press in the days before, but certainly wasn't a major commitment in manifestos or policy documents up to this point. The precise purpose and objectives of this, for me, remains unclear. Exactly why are you doing this? What do you hope to achieve? Is it really about saving money? The evidence for that is certainly in the short to medium term is not strong. To what extent will it be a voluntary process? To what extent will it be a mandatory process? And over what time scale will it unfold? So I don't need to tell you this is potentially a major event and uses huge amounts of bandwidth and political capital, both in the centre of government and in local government. The white paper is dubbed upcoming, and some have said that means later this year, but I've also seen references that have suggested it will be in the spring. So we'll have to wait and see on that, I'm afraid. On devolution more generally, this remains very focused on economic growth and primarily at higher levels of governance. So there's good positive words on progression towards more integrated, flexible settlements for Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Liverpool, North East, South and West Yorkshire, and London. All of that, I think, is very positive, and the business rates retention pilots all continue as well. On service delivery, there's unsurprisingly little in the budget. I think the spring spending review is the focus for that, isn't it? There's a few references to children's services, children's social care. I spotted no references at all to adult social care reform, and both of those are huge areas with potentially major financial as well as service delivery implications. Let's focus now on the business rates tax. In the documents leading up to the election, we were promised fundamental reform, which would replace the tax here. We're now transforming the tax to make it fairer, which is perhaps unsurprising, that shift in emphasis given the overall yield of the tax and how embedded it is both within the tax system and also, of course, in the system of local government finance. So the action instead focuses on short-term measures. So the usual tweaks and changes on reliefs and multipliers focus very much on retail, hospitality, leisure, and small businesses, and also on longer-term measures. So permanent favourable position for retail, hospitality, leisure, and small businesses, paid for through a higher multiplier for larger properties, including distribution warehouses. So this plays into the debates around the health of the high street, on online shopping versus offline shopping, and on using the tax system to incentivise investment and growth. We're assured that local government will be compensated for all of these changes. The Treasury's issued a consultation paper. It will be in close collaboration with my former department, MHCLG, which is where all the real technical expertise lies on the tax. And there's also a revaluation scheduled for 26-27. Anyone feeling tired yet? This is a lot of stuff. Other areas not mentioned, but still very much on the table, not mentioned in the budget, but on the table. There's no reference to the debacle on audit, which is a major issue that needs sorting. There's also no discussion on overall central-local relations. So this for me is beyond devolution. And the way that's currently couched, it relates to the way that the centre of government interacts and behaves towards local government and local democracy. And the question about whether that is put into some point of reference, conceivably statutory form, which governs how government behaves in a future crisis, and what the relationship is on service delivery, where accountability lies, how transparency is assured. Previously, we had a central local concordat, a non-statutory document. That's still available to good booksellers on the internet. And there were many positive words on that. I actually led the work from the central government on that. I think we need something like that in future, and we need to put it on a more permanent basis so it can't just be ignored in the future. Another area not mentioned on Wednesday is sector improvement. There is to be a new public sector reform and innovation fund with 165 million in the coming financial year to fund projects to experiment and spread reform and innovation. So foster carer recruitment is mentioned, and planning reform is mentioned. That needs to be backed up with some more determined approach on how sector improvement happens in local government, leaving it completely open as to how that's organised and done. But for me, there's not enough oomph behind that at the moment. And then finally, in the areas for which there is no mention, council tax, neither reform nor revaluation, business rates detention reform, and fiscal devolution. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Thank you. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Adrian. Will you move the slides?
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. Morning, everybody. So I'm going to take you through, if you move on, Adrian, what I think the budget means for local government. So we can see, as Adrian's outlined, that's an anticipated £3.4 billion in core spending power, better than expected, as the graph show and the graph from the IFS show, but a lower increase than in each of the last 3 years, both in cash terms and in percentage terms. And for the first time in at least 5 years, possibly more, council tax has regained its position as the main funder of of core spending power, the main contributor. I mean, it's already the biggest proportion, but it's also now growing at a faster rate according to these figures. So that will favour high tax base, generally low needs authorities. So Adrian's talked about a view that the government will really have to focus some additional funding just at those high needs, low tax base authorities. So it'll be interesting to see how they go about that. We'll look a little bit about 5%. The assumptions by the OBR that council tax will increase by 5%. That could infer slightly lower, more tightening of the principles, threshold principles, but we'll have a look at that. How will resources distribute between upper and lower tier? I suspect they'll all go to upper tier, but we'll have a quick look. And then there was the extra £1 billion for SEN, wasn't there? And we'll look at that in the context of DSG deficits. And I can't leave one of these sessions without talking accounts audit backlog. So a little bit in just at the end there. If you jump 2 slides, Adrian, I think, so that shouldn't be there. So will that CSP increase of 3.2 billion, 3.4 billion rather, will it have an impact? Will it solve the financial resilience concerns of the sector? Well, I suspect not. And if you look at the pattern between CSP increases, which is the blue line there, and usable revenue reserves, which is kind of the accepted measure of local government financial resilience. When you run out of reserves, you run out of road, and you tend to go 114, or prior to that, need exceptional financial support to prevent that. In the 2 years that there were exceptionally large increases in CSP, there were also exceptionally almost unprecedented reductions in reserves across the sector. So with a smaller increase, it feels hard to see whether at this stage there's a right lot that would stop the resilience worries, suggesting the downward trend on reserves might continue. If we move on another slide, but this reduction in reserves is different according to different areas, different types of authorities, and there are some types of authorities suffering a lot more than others. Outer London authorities and Mets are not doing as well. I think that London, there might be some interplay within London and the fact that formula haven't been set, but populations have grown, perhaps as they've pushed out to Outer London. Mets tend to have low tax bases, high needs. They've really struggled in terms of the last 15 years of the 3 previous governments. Counties and districts, counties on the flip side, tend to have better tax bases, and have, although they're traditionally lower funded, they've grown more over the Conservative government period. And districts do really well out of business rates. So there's something there, isn't there? So there's lots of reasons for this difference, but will 3.4 billion be capable of addressing those and addressing not only the overall quantum, but the difference in resilience that we're now seeing with some types of authorities really, really struggling? If you move on, Adrian. So what I did last year when the settlement came out, and had a look at the settlement, looked at the type of authorities that would benefit, but also then laid them looked at the increases in core spending power as a proportion in terms of IMD. So on that graph you see there, you've got the most deprived on the left, the least deprived on the right. So you've got Blackpool on the left, followed by Knowsley, and you've got Wokingham on the far right. What you saw last year was there was a very slight better increase for more deprived authorities. It was very, very slight. Most authorities got roughly the same increase in core spending powers, but there was slightly more at the higher needs end. But that was when there was 2.3 billion of extra government funding, so the ability for government to change it, versus 1.9 billion of extra council tax. And at the time, I argued that you needed that targeted funding, which mainly targeted through social care, just to equalise the impact of council tax. Well, in 25-26, we've got a lot more council tax. So you'll have those high tax-based authorities potentially growing ahead, getting ahead, and only the 1.2 billion of government, 1.3 billion of government funding to try and equalise that impact. And we'll see that if we look at the next slide. If you look at, it should show council tax. So again, with the most deprived on the left, least deprived on the right, you can see like an upward trend as you get lesser deprived to higher tax-based authorities, where council tax goes, the 5% on council tax tends to go up by more. So at the point that there's a lot more council tax in the system, the government's going to have to really try hard, as Adrian said, to equalise that impact. They've only got 1.3 billion or 2.1 billion last year to do that. So this targeted fund that might just be based upon deprivation, and similarly to Adrian, I think IMD is our best proxy for deprivation, needs to be really targeted. Else, the spending power figures will come out and show at least more deprived areas doing less well. And I wonder actually whether there's enough in that 1.3 billion and whether they might grab some of the existing controlled totals. So new homes bonus, RSDG, funding guarantee, maybe some of that will go towards equalising the impact of council tax. I don't know, but we'll know more in December. If we move on, this takes us to the districts. The districts, there is no correlation between deprivation and spending power. There's a massive correlation between changes in spending power and tax base. So low needs, high tax based authorities have raced ahead in core spending power, and the most deprived authorities that have very low tax bases, low tax base growth, massive amounts of council tax support, are still up to 30% below their 11-12 figures in terms of core spending power. And there's been no equalisation for districts. In the upper tier, social care grants have equalised the impact of tax base. I can't see that changing very much, as people have said in the chat, and both Adrian and Stuart said, there's not a lot in this, I don't think, for districts, because upper tier is on its knees, and therefore I don't think the government's got its eyes on the districts. And if we move on one more, I think there's a danger here for districts, because when I look at usable reserves, the proxy for financial resilience, there are now district reserves went up by 5. And a lot of that, I think, is because there's lots of business rates growth sat in reserves, awaiting a reset that's never come yet, but will come one day. But district reserves are up, but they're only up in aggregate. When you look at the distribution, you're now seeing half of districts that are seeing reserves deplete, some at quite alarming rates. But I think there's a danger the government will look at the overall figures and think, well, districts are okay. And it's absolutely right that the upper tier authorities are really struggling, but that's not to say that there aren't a large amount of districts struggling as well. And when the reset comes, some of those districts that are doing okay might struggle, particularly if they've had to use some of that business rates growth into their base budget. So I think there's a problem for districts, of at least for some districts, that I wonder if it is slightly less visible to government than some of the really obvious problems around social care. If we move on, Adrian, please. So I just look a little bit at the council tax referendum principles. We were a bit nervous that if the OBR is saying 5%, well, 5% tends to be properties, mainly social care. No districts only get 3% of the £5, and similarly fire gets something less. But 5% seem to indicate that there might be thresholds, a tightening of the referendum thresholds principles. We don't think it will. We think that's doubtful. And when I look back, actually, if you see in 24-25, this is just councils. Overall, council tax went up by nearly 7%. Just the councils, it went up by 6.4%. And that was a mixture of an average 5% increase in Band D. That was heightened by your Thurrocks and your Sloughs and 1 or 2 at Birmingham's that were allowed to put 10 or even 15% on it. But there was still over 1% increase in tax base, which made much more than the 5% that the OBR is thinking. Now, we don't think they're going to tighten principles. It would just be madness, really, to do so. Could it be that the OBR's had a quick look at the CTB1 data and can see that tax base hasn't grown very much? I'm not sure. I just probably think the OBR forecasts are wrong. Or maybe there's council elections next year, isn't it? And if you look 4 years ago, which was right in the middle of COVID, actually, maybe the factoring in elections and the thought that not everyone will take the 5%. But I think the main thing to say is that we're not really convinced that they're going to reduce the 5% for upper tier and the 3% for districts and the equivalent for fire. But you never know. It's not absolutely certain until the settlement comes out. If we move on, Adrian, and now on to SEN deficits. DSG deficits, just an area of massive stress. I've looked with a lot of our members at this, and DSG, I think, is probably the biggest issue out at the moment. Deficits are accelerating at pretty all authorities. Even authorities that have got a bit of a surplus are now seeing that reduced and moving towards a deficit. There are 2 authorities where their DSG deficit is higher than the entirety of their usable revenue reserves. 2 authorities at the moment. I think if the run rates continue in terms of the depletion of reserves and the acceleration of DSG deficits, that'll easily be in double figures in 24-25. So it's a real problem. You can see from those graphs, massive deficits in 3/4 of authorities, and over 3/4 of authorities where deficits are increasing, and they're increasing at an accelerated rate. You're now starting to see authorities that are having to fund those deficits through short-term borrowing. It's their internal borrowing positions have cratered, and they're now having to externally borrow just for deficits. It's a real mess and a real area of stress at upper tier. And if we move on one, you'll see there that the bold black line is the aggregate of deficits over the last few years. I've just put a dotted black line that is if it carries on at that run rate. And actually, when I speak to people, they say, no, it's accelerating. So you could see a steepness in that line. But what you are seeing then is if I put the £1 billion back in, I'm not sure where the government gets an 865 million reduction in spending. But if you put that green line back in and assume that it's in the base, actually deficits are increasing by around 800 to 900 million a year. If they're putting £1 billion in, then actually that will stabilise the system. If nothing else, and it'd be interesting to see what people think, if nothing else, the very fact that they've recognised this as a huge problem is a huge step forward. Whether they get sorted is another thing. But this indicates that they've made a really good first step towards sorting DSG deficits. It'd be interesting to think, those of you with large deficits, what you feel about that. And a couple more slides, just some in way of conclusion. So it is better than expected, but still lower than the last 3 years. And the last 3 years weren't great in terms of resilience, and there's less money. Council tax is the majority funder, and that will really make it hard to say that low tax-based authorities are going to do equally as well and tend to be high needs authority. So I do wonder if the government will go elsewhere for that, as well as the targeted fund, which Adrian talked of, in order to equalise council tax. It was always the case, if council tax became 2/3 of spending power, it has so many redistributional effects that you have less and less money to try and correct those. Hard to see the districts getting anything very much from the settlement. The SEN thing's a really big step forward. But I think what really needs to happen, Stuart indicated this, Adrian, as well, is this is a one-year settlement, isn't it? And they're doing the best that they can. There's been some positive things, but it is a fairer set of multi-year settlements with a return of some form of formulae that is going to mend this if it's capable of mending. And in the meantime, there's always exceptional financial support for authorities that can't really afford it. If we move on to one last slide, as I said at the start, can't leave this without talking about the accounts audit backlog. Looked at this last night, a load of authorities, probably in the last week, 15 or 16 authorities got their 22-23 accounts published in order that they can start the 30-day working day inspection period that finishes on the backstop day of the 13th of December. So massive amounts of accounts backlog being caught up. We're way ahead at this time of the year than we were at the same point further on in the year in terms of 23-24. So it does feel that I've said this before, finance teams are doing their bit. The accounts backlog is catching up, but I still don't see a massive acceleration in audits getting signed off, and it'll be really interesting over the next 2, 3, 4 months to see whether those audit firms and some of the new firms, some of the existing firms have the capacity to do their bit as part of this process. But I think from the point of view of accounts teams, there's been a massive increase in accounts getting over the line. Both, even Thurrock, I think Slough and Croydon aren't far off. Woking have got up to 22, 23, and they were 2 or 3 years behind previously. So there's a big push from the sector, from the government sector. One would hope that then is matched now by your auditors, so that the thing starts to get mended and the need to do these sort of analyses goes, because everybody gets back to being able to publish on the day, and the auditors get back to being able to get the accounts audited by the end of September. And that's it. Thank you very much.
That's great. Fantastic, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Stuart. For those of you who've got to go now, thanks for coming along. The recording will be on the website, I think probably Monday, but it might be this afternoon, and we'll get the slides straight on the website immediately afterwards. But for now, let's go on to question and answer and discussion. Come forward, any points you've got, put them in the chat, put your hand up, just start speaking. Whatever. There's been a lot of questions in the chat today. I've tried to get back to many of them, but I think there's a lot in there. So there's a lot of questions. So if you've got anything you want to come forward with, just put your hand up. Okay, Graham. And then Steve, and then Martin. Okay, go for it, Graham.
Yeah, just a thought. It seems to me absolutely crazy to be thinking about wholesale structural reform of local government, and at the same time trying to devise a new formula. A new formula for what structure?
Yeah.
I would be amazed if there's the capacity within the department to do either properly. But actually, the very principle of trying to produce a new formula when you're trying to change the structure just seems absolute madness.
Yeah, I agree with Graham. Plus, the other thing is, if councils are struggling with balancing budgets, the last thing you need is to be distracted with huge reorganisation. I think it's an odd thing to have come. It feels like it's come out of nowhere as well. I don't know what you think, Stuart.
Yes, I think it feels like a relatively late decision before the budget, and one that's for many people was quite surprising. Much depends on the phasing of it. So if the Devo paper comes out and it moves to a more kind of softer approach where people come forward and implement over a period of years with maybe a backstop, that could allow finance reform to be implemented, at least, although not fully transitioned through the system before the peaks of restructuring. But we'll just have to see. Yeah, but I mean, I absolutely see what you say, Graham. This usually huge political and technical bandwidth and credibility.
And it hasn't clearly worked at Cumbria. You've got Cumberland that's got exceptional financial support.
Yes.
At least one of the Northamptonshire's new unitaries has got exceptional financial support. Somerset has applied for it. Somerset asked for a 10% tax increase last year that was denied. So it's not as even as if the ones where it's worked recently are working on the if you just took it as a finance.
Yeah, and I think it's clear. Well, I think it's clear that we're talking about more than 2 tiers moving to 1 tier. The department's surely concerned about small unitaries who've shown themselves to struggle when because their resilience is low.
Yeah, I've heard that the department, this is I think through MJ, saying that they're looking for new unitaries to be created around 500,000, and the existing single tier authorities with fewer than 200,000 residents, looking at merging. So they're certainly saying that they're looking at big unitaries. Yes,
I could tease Martin by saying that that's larger than the average London borough.
But smaller than GLA.
Yes.
That depends whether you're talking about population and fiscal size or whether you're talking about geographical size.
Yes. Absolutely.
If you're going to achieve those sort of population numbers in many rural areas, you are talking huge monoliths with virtually no, little or no sort of commonality of interest within the borders.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
That's great. Yeah, take that point entirely, Graham. Steve.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks for the presentation. Really, really insightful. I think some of the comments that I'm going to make, I think they have been highlighted predominantly within the comments, written comments generally. I think whilst it's probably a better settlement than some were expecting, I actually think it's a terrible settlement, personally. I think given the fact that there are a number of other sort of changes as part of the budget, the national living wage increase, the national insurance increase, and the knock-on impact that's going to have in terms of cost and cost pressures that council's got to deliver, the funding that is actually being awarded, those costs more than outweigh, and that's before you even get into sort of demand pressures, etc. From my point of view, it's disappointing in terms of all the lobbying that the sector did prior to the budget. You may or may not be aware that all the leading bodies that sort of, I guess, support the main areas of local government all wrote to the Chancellor direct and to the Prime Minister direct, actually highlighting, some of the pressures that we were under. And yes, they will, I guess sort of government will argue that they've reflected on that and provided additional funding, specifically in terms of the general social care grant increase and the SEND monies, which were ultimately the two areas that were highlighted in that letter, etc., as well as homelessness. Let's not forget about homelessness as well. Mm-hmm. But the amount that's actually been provided, I think we've pointed out, or it's been pointed out in the comments, is significantly less than the last 4 years, to be honest. Mm-hmm. So especially given the amount of money that's actually been pumped into the NHS and into education. So whilst perhaps some commentators think it's better than we're expected, I actually think it's worse than what I were expecting. I were expecting a little bit more, I guess, and I find it quite disappointing from my point of view. But that's my view anyway.
Yeah, I guess you could say, Steve, that to some degree that letter worked in that local government got a better settlement than anyone else in the sector, in the public sector. But I take your point that it's all about what you think is enough. I know another representative body was thinking that the minimum amount that social care should have got was £1 billion. So 600 million is quite a bit short of that. But it's a fair point.
Is it too early to mention, notwithstanding the fact that aggregate totals have been published for future years, how much extra money there might be in the spring spending review. It would be a very odd spring spending review if it didn't come forward with additional money.
Right. Yeah, because that looks very tight, doesn't it, from 26, 27, Stuart? Yeah. But I guess the other question about is, given what's available from 26, 27, can we reasonably expect it to be better than 25, 26? So is 25, 26 as good as we can expect? I kind of think it is. I can't see 26, 27 being better than 25, 26.
But I think there's also, because you're from represent Barnsley, Stephen, for me there's the distribution, and it's slightly less worse in upper tier than lower tier. But Barnsley's high needs. You took some massive cuts under the pickles for 3 or 4 years, and you'll have relatively high council tax support, and you'll have had a tax base that hasn't caught up like it has in other areas. And that, the big thing for me is that there's a need potentially for resources equalisation, but that becomes harder, doesn't it, when there's less money, because they'll want to make sure nobody loses too much and damp away. But you could argue there's been such a divergence of funding since 10-11, 12-13 was last year when formulae were calculated, that, you know, it's not just quantum's one thing, but the distribution of that, the size of the slice of the cake is another one. And one would hope that they'll get on with that for the next set of settlements after this year. That's where I see lots of
let's hope so. You are right. You know, obviously, if you look at the stats, you know, most, if not all, the majority of all sort of local authorities have seen a cut in core spending power in real terms over the sort of 14 years of government, but the actual range of those cuts, etc., and it's that really needs to be addressed from our perspective. You're right. So fingers crossed. You know, it'll be interesting to see wherever pot of money they do distribute on a needs basis. It'll be interesting to see the methodology that they actually use in terms of that. And subsequently, like you say, any sort of fair funding review that they undertake as part of the sort of, you know, future sort of settlements, etc., future spending review and settlements will also sort of be interesting, to be honest. But you know, I do honestly think that we've still got some quite turbulent times ahead as a sector. And I'm speaking from the sector's perspective there, not just from Barnsley's own perspective. You know, and really we like you've mentioned in terms of the audit, the actual sector, you know, quite often steps up to sort of the requirements that government are putting on us. You know, look at what happened with COVID and all the response that we actually did as a sector, etc. But let's see.
Well, actually, one thing that made me think from Dan's presentation about how that targeted deprivation funding might be distributed is that, you know, I was thinking about it in terms of need, but maybe it'll be distributed in terms of compensating for lack of council tax generation power. You know, so much of the core spending power increase is going to be about council tax. So maybe that remaining 700 million will be about compensating authorities who can't generate as much revenue from the council tax base, potentially.
Yeah, we talked previously about doing something on council tax equalisation in advance of the full reform, and of course that would take you in the general direction that the government will ultimately hope to head in. And just following on from Steve's comment, of course, whatever reform you do, you're going to likely have to transition towards it, and there's a difficult judgment then, because in effect, however you construct it, the rate at which, let's call them winners, gain is reduced by the payments that you make towards relative losers to cushion the impact. And there's a very difficult judgment there about how quickly you can move to the desired position.
That's a fair point, Stuart. Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adrian. So it's just really following on from the council tax point and around council tax support schemes, because we are finding in Outer London, obviously has been highlighted by some of the figures we've seen previously from Dan, the real challenges they're facing around temporary accommodation, and they're running out of options. And now there's a consistent pattern of seeking to materially reduce the levels of support provided through council tax support schemes to working age households. So potentially reducing, minimum contributions or maximum level of support by 15-20%, which actually is going to mean we've already seen it in one Outer London borough as of last April, but potentially the most vulnerable low-income households not seeing a 5% council tax rise, but a 100% council tax rise, and potentially paying £400-500 a year more because they've just ran out of options, and that's about the only discretionary area they have left. And clearly that's going to be compounded by higher pension credit take-up, which is obviously going to make potentially retired council tax support scheme costs more expensive, and obviously that's going to impact on some authorities more than others, because one thing that hasn't been picked up, obviously, with the winter fuel allowance is, yeah, you get pension credit, you get that, but actually you get automatic 100% exemption from council tax, which is actually a much bigger benefit. So just wondering if that was something that's being seen in the rest of the country or is being looked at, because to me we are getting this huge divergence and postcode lottery in London between in London boroughs and Outer London boroughs in terms of council tax support scheme, and it's not particularly equitable or fair. And again, is this something that authorities in other parts of the country are looking to make savings in because they've sort of run out of options given their pressures elsewhere?
I think I do see it. I look at one of the things I look at when I look at the accounts is the collection fund adjustment account, which carries in-year or the aggregate of in-year deficits or surpluses, doesn't it? And you're really now starting to see collection fund adjustment accounts move from surplus positions to deficits, and collection rates are starting to come down. And that you've just mentioned, Martin, and I think Kate's put in the chat as well about changes to universal credit, it's going to make it harder for people who are already struggling to make ends meet, and that will manifest as lower collection rates as people aren't able to pay council tax. And I think you do. I haven't looked at it in any detail yet, but when I look at certain authorities that I know are high needs, you can see more pressure on their collection funds, on their collection rates, etc. So I think that will start to impact differentially, and it's as with all these things at the moment, it's almost the perfect storm. It's those that are struggling the most that will continue to struggle from things like this.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, because obviously it would also be seen in much higher council tax base increases for other authorities that are cutting back on CTS schemes, which might distort the numbers. So again, that's just something that needs to be bear in mind when MHCLG come to analyse some of this data later on. But thanks, Dan, for that update.
A couple of points as well, Dan, about the council tax stuff. Jenny mentioned that in the absence of policy change, that the OBR assumed that council tax Band D goes up with precepts go up by 4.8%. But I guess even with that 4.8%, I think I would have assumed that the yield would have been a bit higher. Do you think there is something else that's been taken into account? Like stuff that Marty's been talking about.
It can only be. I mean, it'll come out next week. I'm really excited to get the CTB1 stats out next week. So I am. But in the last couple of in the COVID year, tax base has dropped nationally. But in the last couple of 3 years, they're about 1.2, 1.4% growth. So the only thing I can think of, if they're saying that, is that they've seen CTB figures nationally, and that there's been a slowdown in housing growth, and therefore the tax base assumptions are closer to 0%, and the assumptions on Band D are the thresholds, which would give you about a 4.8, I guess.
Yeah, could be, couldn't it? Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not saying that the thresholds for council tax will be unchanged, but I think it'd be odd to slip that through at this point, or for that to have been reflected in OBR data without it being kind of more broadly announced. I don't know what you think about that, Stuart, but it's such a big change, isn't it? It's not a technical adjustment to the numbers. It's a big policy difference. Yeah.
It's, I mean, as you mentioned before, these figures on core spending power and local government generally are are quite provisional in nature at this stage. The main aim will be to not publish any numbers that might later prove to be wrong. So any estimate of core spending power, which is in real terms is based on an inflation assumption, has got to be a little bit conservative in order when the inflation, if it might change by December, you don't want to be wrong at that point. So it's not impossible that we'll see a higher number at the provisional settlement.
Yeah, I think as well, Stuart, a couple of questions there, like Peter talking about Newham's bonus. Will it continue? Obviously, for some councils, it's still a big deal. Will that be funded from the 1.3? Will it be funded from other parts of core spending power? I mean, we just don't know. I mean, you made the point that you think NHB, it's too late to kind of really roll back on it, and it's probably going to be there again for one more year. But we just don't know. We don't know how it'd be funded either, do we?
Well, I think the funding ought to be in the baseline. I mean, first of all, in policy terms, there's been no proposal, no consultation from government. Although I would say there's also no evidence that government sees financial incentives of this nature as forming part of its kind of housing promotion policy. There's also limited evidence of the effectiveness of a new homes bonus incentive over housing numbers. So I think it is very much dying on its feet, but there's advantage in having it for one more year. Those houses are already built. You've got less kind of turbulence in the system by continuing. And if you make it clear you're terminating it after the coming financial year, then authorities have more of a period of notice, and in effect you've produced some money which is unallocated, which you can then use in the reform process to make it a little bit easier than it would otherwise have been.
And I guess if the reason why OBR is saying the 5% is because of low tax base, that means low housing growth means they'll save money on NHB because it's a 1-year grant based upon last year's tax base growth, isn't it? So that would, I can't remember what it was, a couple of $100 million, but that would, if tax base growth is a third of what it was, they only have to pay roughly a third of NHB out, which will give them a bit more money to play with. Yeah,
that's true. Actually, one point I was just thinking about, with NHB, one kind of good reason for not continuing with it is actually most people who would lose out from getting rid of NHB will probably get most of it back through the minimum funding guarantee. There's a little bit of circularity there. The other point I wanted to just sort of raise and just sort of put on my memory is that if there is more money for national insurance contributions which come through the settlement, just making sure that's adjusted for properly with the minimum funding guarantee, and that people don't lose that additional funding through the MFG. I'm sure that'll be done properly, but it's just one thing to be aware of. Quickly, I don't know if anyone's got any points to make about EPR. I mean, it's such a lot of additional money. When we'll know, we don't know. I don't know. I'm assuming DEFRA will tell us before we get to the settlement, or maybe they'll be in next month or this month's policy statement. I don't know, but it's a lot of money.
So I coincidentally was the lead on the first round of producer responsibility way back when, and we were very clear then that the monies that flowed from this were intended to fund additional recycling infrastructure, and that was the deal with the industry lobbies that were paying this money. They were being effectively taxed additional, but at least the money would pay for extra infrastructure. The previous administration was not always explicit on that. There were strong hints that would be netted off from local authority resources. I didn't spot any reference to that this time round, which is obviously welcome from our perspective, and I think the right thing to do.
I've heard as well, Stuart, officials saying informally to councils it'll be a windfall. Right. But I take your point. That wasn't the case the last time this was going to be brought in, and it would be an odd thing for it not to be tied to something.
Yes.
Yeah. not far off the end of the session, but I just wanted to. I say Christmas comes around earlier every year, but we're already starting to think about what the date will be for the provisional settlement. My guess is always on that last week before Christmas. Every year, officials say it'll be early, but I'm sure it'll begin that last week before Christmas.
Yes. Well, one person commented that the date will not be fixed yet, and I'm sure that's absolutely the case. There's a period of time required to do the work, including extensive checking, which can take up to 2 weeks to be sure that there are no mistakes that Martin will spot for us. At the last minute, it's the communications people that determine, and parliamentary people that determine when the date actually is. Yeah. And I forget what I was telling you. Oh, sorry. I was going to say also, there's a bit of a precedent now for not doing an oral statement and just putting it out as a written statement. So no kind of slot in Parliament. It'll be interesting to see whether Labour revives that age-old tradition or continues with recent precedent and just puts material on the web. Yeah, I guess if they're announcing a new deprivation-focused funding stream, they'll probably want to take as many of the plaudits as possible, won't they? Stand up in the House and say thanks very much. Yeah, they do have the final settlement debate to do that. That's a mandatory debate in Parliament, but that's not till February. Yeah. That's great. Any other questions? Any other points? Probably pretty much. John.
Sorry, Stuart. Adrian, I had to drop off for a couple of seconds, and it may have already been something you've answered, so apologies. The query about, in terms of homelessness prevention funding and kind of how that's been allocated, have you had a question about that and an answer? If not, I'll just pick it up from we haven't talked about it at all, actually, John. We haven't talked about it at all. The extra 230 million. No, we haven't. And I suppose I just didn't know whether kind of what people's kind of whether there was any kind of, from what you've read, anything about actually how that would be distributed in terms of interlocal authorities and what that might look like. No, we've not talked about it. I've not seen anything about that at all, John. Okay. Whether that would be on the similar sort of basis to the existing homelessness grants, I just don't know. Okay. It's not something that's in the model either, but it's something I think I will bring in because it's becoming more and more important and there's more and more money in it. So I guess watch this space and we'll try and do Brilliant. More. No, I'm just quite conscious that actually it's kind of, for a lot of authorities, it's quite a large pressure area. So well, it is. So actually just understanding if there's anything that's been considered about it, but I know it will kind of come out in the wash when the settlement happens, but it's just whether there'd been any discussion about it. So apologies for having to drop off for 10 or 15 minutes. That's great. I think you're right. It's going to be, for many councils, it's almost the biggest growth area, isn't it? It's the thing. So I'm not surprised there's more money, but we'll keep more of an eye on that, John. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, that's great. So we're pretty much at the end of our allotted time. Thanks for your questions and comments. Thanks, Stuart. Thanks, Dan. And we'll see you soon. Yeah. Thank you. See you soon, everyone. Bye. Cheers.